Without further ado, I want to bring up our next speaker, Mark W. Smith. Now, Professor Mark W. Smith is a constitutional lawyer and the producer and host of the popular Four Boxes Diner YouTube channel, which addresses Second Amendment scholarship, history, and legal issues. I am a regular member of his postings. I go there all the time to learn more about how to do what I do. Mark is a New York Times bestselling author who frequently appears on the Fox News channel. His books include Disarmed: What the Ukraine War Teaches Americans About Our Right to Keep and Bear Arms. Also, First They Came for the Gun Owners, and Duped: How the Anti-Gun Lobby Exploits the Parkland School Shooting. I give you Mark W. Smith.
All right, so I'll just talk to you just for 1 minute about how I became a media person, and we're not going to talk about that since they've already did an excellent presentation of it. Then I'm going to talk to you about how to interact with the media, and since Lee Williams did such a great job of some of the mechanics of it, I'm going to talk about some of the substantive things that I found useful on Fox News and CNN and other places where I've had to do interviews. So just to let you know that in 2000, I was simply a lawyer at a large law firm in New York City as an associate. When the 2000 election became the 2000 litigation in Florida, prompting a phone call from MSNBC, believe it or not, to me to say, Mark, we hear you're one of the few right-wing conservative Republican lawyers in New York City that's under the age of 60. Can you come on and defend the Bush position? And I said, sure, I would be happy to do that, because back then on cable news, you'd actually have debates, and that gave rise to appearing as a regular on Court TV, on Hannity and Combs and so on. And then what I found was I kept having to do the debate on these same topics. I'd be asked about affirmative action or about guns or the war in Iraq, whatever it was. And I got thinking, geez, I need to buy a book. I need to buy a book. And the book I need to buy is the one that lays out all the conservative talking points on every topic that I'm going to be asked about on Hannity and Combs by Alan Combs. And I went to find this book and I could not find the book. So I wound up writing the book, The Official Handbook of the Vast Right-Wing Conspiracy, which became a major New York Times best-selling book. And next thing you know, I go from being a lawyer to a best-selling author, and now I'm on the circuit of New York City, giving rise to various opportunities, including, for example, being a Tony Award voter on Broadway, no less. So I have a lot of interaction and a lot of experience in talking to people that are not natural allies of ours, and what might work and what not. So I want to share, because the media in the reality, if we're not talking about our allies, our friendlies, the Deans of the world, the Sheryls of the world, right, the Jareds of the world, we're talking to a lot of people that don't understand guns, they don't understand gun law. And what I call this is, and this is going to be a little geeky for you lawyers, but if you're a lawyer, you're going to know what I'm about to say. I call it the patent law problem, the patent law problem. Now, what is the patent law problem? Well, patent law, if you think about it, has two problems from the point of view of talking to judges. For those of you who litigate, I was a trial lawyer for many decades, very successful, and I have what I call the patent problem. Now, what this is this. You go in front of a judge in a patent case, and there's two fundamental problems you have as an advocate in front of a judge dealing with patent law. And that is, number one, the judges don't understand patent law at all. Why? Because they never see a patent case. They see one patent case every several years. They never learn the law. Like, contract law, race discrimination law, they know that. Tort law, they know this. They just remembered it. They see it all the time. They know the law already before they even read your case. But that's not the case with patent law. And likewise, that's not the case with Second Amendment law. Because the only people that go in front of judges today involving guns, as a general matter, are criminals that are basically dead to rights. That's the harsh reality. So if they see gun in the court, they're assuming it's a criminal. They usually don't have a defense. They're kind of dead to rights. So, they don't really learn about the Second Amendment in a robust way. So as a practical matter, they don't know Second Amendment law any more than these judges don't know patent law. Then you have a second problem with patent law and Second Amendment law. And what is that? Even if you get a judge that understands the law that's to be applied, guess what? They don't understand the technology. So you're saying, hey, my computer software program is different than theirs, or it's not different than theirs, or my camera design is different than their camera design, or my electrical outlet is different than their electrical outlet. The judges have no idea what you're talking about. Not only do they not understand the law, they don't understand the technology. That is also the case with guns. They don't know the difference between a magazine and a clip. a semi-automatic pistol versus a revolver. And I will tell you from my conversations with extremely intelligent, high IQ, very prominent, famous judges, who I will not name, they'll tell you, I'm really, supportive of the Constitution. I support the Second Amendment. I get it. I've never shot a gun. And if you think about it, and coming from these elite urban circles where a lot of these judges come from, the reality is they go to some fancy prep school, right? They go to Princeton, they go to like NYU law where I went, or they go to Harvard law, and they have never had an opportunity to touch guns. They're always in some urban environment, and even if they're interested in guns, there's no way for them to get involved because of where they are. So by the time they become judges, a lot of them have never even touched a gun. So you go in front of them, they don't understand Second Amendment law, and then they don't understand firearms technology, and they don't know history or anything else. And that is a big obstacle that we in the Second Amendment community have to overcome. And why does that tie into today's talk about the media? It's really quite simple. Judges read a lot. They're very smart, right? The reality is most judges became judges because they did not like blood and they like indoor work and air conditioning, right? So what do you do? So we're not going to be a doctor and work for an HMO. That's not enough fun. So they become judges. They become lawyers and they become judges. And the reality is they read a lot. They read the papers. They read media. They read the Drudge Report. They read this stuff. They read the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. So that is the segue into this. Not only do they read it, but their law clerks read it. Okay. So every Supreme Court justice, of which there are 9, obviously, also has somewhere between 3 to 5 law clerks. They're all equally elite. Even if they're sympathetic to the Second Amendment, they're going to come from the same elite urban backgrounds of the NYUs, the Harvards, the Princetons, the Stanfords, with the same limited exposure to the Second Amendment law as well as to guns. Okay. And as a consequence, it's very important in the Second Amendment community that we try to teach people about guns and the Second Amendment and our history. History is equally important. We'll get to that in 1 minute. So there's 3 things. We got to talk about guns, how guns work, what is the Second Amendment, how does it work, and then, of course, the history behind it. And, of course, that is why talking to the media is very important, because the influence makers are reading. Now, it's not just judges, by the way. For those of you who know what tort law is, that's when the slip and falls and negligence, you run someone over, you slip and fall, or, whatever it is, the ladder's not set up right, and the ladder falls on someone's head. It's tort law. You get sued for negligence. Well, the basic rule of tort law is this. You always want to avoid the tort, right? It doesn't do you any good if you're paralyzed and you get a $50 million verdict, right? You're better to avoid the tort, keep the $50 million, and I get to keep walking, right? So the rule 1 is avoid the tort. Now, what does this mean, and how does it apply to us? We want to avoid Second Amendment lawsuits. We don't want Second Amendment lawsuits, because if we're in a Second Amendment lawsuit fighting some gun control law, in some ways we've already lost, if you think about it. A law has been enacted that says guns are bad. A law has been enacted that says 18, 19, and 20-year-olds cannot carry guns. A law has been enacted and a semi-automatic rifle cannot be possessed, whatever it is. We are better off preventing the tort from occurring in the first place. What I mean by that is we're better off preventing the law from being enacted in the first place. And one of the ways of doing that is through education, talking to the media, expressing our views, letting people, the decision makers, understand what we're talking about, and try to prevent the law from being enacted in the first place. Avoid the tort, if you will. And that's why the work that we're doing today involving the media, and there's so many of you, I listen to you on X or your podcast. It's great to see all this, but because it's very important work. And whenever we talk to the media, now we're going to break down into some specific things, and Cheryl, you'll tell me when I'm running out of time. There's ways to do it. So the reason why I gave you a little bit of a background is there are certain things that I've found that has been effective over the years in talking to a lot of liberals. And even the funniest things, liberals want to protect their own lives and the lives of their families. So in some ways, the gun issue should be totally bipartisan. The reason why it's not bipartisan, in my view, in many respects, is that people on the other side don't understand guns at all. It's like the scary object that can jump out of the drawer and shoot them in the middle of the night because they have no experience with it. And once you give them some experience with it, we're always much better off with this form of education. So this is the one area, and I will just leave you with this, and then I'll move to the specifics. I've said for many years that and I'm going to pat everyone in this room on the back. This is the one area of the modern conservative movement that we actually have advanced the ball. If you look at immigration, well, we have open borders. Hasn't worked out that super well, right? If you look at all these other issues associated, what do you want to call it, gay rights, abortion, whatever you want to say, if you look at the record, the one area of the conservative movement where we've not only been able to conserve our rights but advance them is the Second Amendment movement. We are better off today. We have 29 states that have permitless carry. When I was growing up, we had Vermont and maybe Alaska. That was it. We now have 29 states that are permitless carry. Well, that doesn't occur just by random coincidence. And we have a Supreme Court now, right? A Supreme Court now that is pro-Second Amendment in that they follow the law. We have Heller, we have Bruin, we have Rahimi, we have McDonald, we have Connell. This was unheard of, decades before in the era of the Reagan years, for example. So there's a lot for us to be optimistic and happy about in the Second Amendment movement, and we should never lose sight that we're the one part of the conservative movement that has actually succeeded and is succeeding now. And if Trump is reelected, as I've said repeatedly, it will be game over for the anti-gun movement in America. Game over. It will be. Because once you embolden the Supreme Court to do the right thing, I think that there's no Second Amendment case that we should not win because the text is on our side, the public policy arguments are on our side, and the history is on our side. And we're going to get to all that in just 1 second. Okay? Now, with that said, let's talk about some critical things that I found that used. And when I'm giving you this information, this is one, if I get a phone call from the New York Times or I get a phone call from someone to give them a couple sound bites, because as Michael Clement of the Epoch Times will tell you, there's only so many words in an article you can write, right? So you want to give them something pithy, get to the point that they can incorporate into their article or their piece. And we will talk about the different kinds of media at the very end of this presentation. Okay, so let's talk about the key language that I want you to use and why I want you to use it to begin with. When you talk about assault weapons, AR-15s and AK-47s, ready? I want you to talk to the media using the following language. You're going to call these things semi-automatic rifles. Semi-automatic rifles. Why? Because Justice Brett Kavanaugh in 2011, in his dissent in Heller 2, described semi-automatic rifles as something that cannot be banned because they're the same as semi-automatic handguns that cannot be banned under the Supreme Court's 2008 decision in Heller. If Brett Kavanaugh calls them semi-automatic rifles, so do you. And also gives us the greatest scope of protection if we get semi-automatic rifles protected, which undeniably we should. It should be an easy case. You cover not just AR-15s and AK-47s, but you cover AK-74s, you cover AR-10s, and so on, right? So semi-automatic rifles is what you want to use, and that's why you want to use it. In addition to the fact that Justice Alito and Justice Thomas, in their concurrence in Caetano in 2016, refers to semi-automatic pistols as being protected. How can you protect semi-automatic pistols and not semi-automatic rifles? You simply can't. Obviously, you got to protect both. Number 2, weapons of war. Okay, well, there's 2 quick things when they use the phrase weapons of war. Number 1, of course, is that AR-15 semi-automatic rifles are generally speaking never used in weapons of war because everyone uses select fire, which is fully automatic and semi-automatic. Now, the reason why it's very important to distinguish between fully automatic weapons and semi-automatic weapons is not because Mark Smith says so. It's because the Supreme Court says so. In the 1994 case of Staples versus the United States, the Supreme Court made it very clear that semi-automatic weapons are totally protected or are protected and are different than fully automatic. Now, right now, there is no way for us, here's the harsh reality of it, I know I get harassed on social media about this. We do not have 5 votes for the Supreme Court to say machine guns are protected. I do not think we can get to 5 votes on that issue. And if you look at the oral argument in the bump stock case of Cargill, if you look at the questions and comments by both Justice Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, you can see we just don't have 5 votes for machine guns, fully automatic machine guns being protected arms. Not going to get there right now, okay? But you do for semi-automatic firearms, as we saw in Staples and in Heller, okay? So therefore, when you talk about weapons of war, it is important to say that semi-automatic rifles are undeniably protected. Nobody brings a purely semi-automatic rifle into battle with them in any military in the world. It's always select fire at a minimum, right? It's always one. You get to fully automatic or both, select fire. Number 2 is also historically. Remember I tell you that every issue we're talking about today, we went on public policy and we also went on history. What is the history of Americans owning weapons of war? Not that hard. We know that after World War II, you literally can buy actual weapons of war that were actually used in World War II to shoot people, right? The M1 Garand and the M1 carbine, right? These were actual World War II rifles actually used that you could buy. You can probably still buy them right now. The point is, we actually have actual weapons of war which is not the AR-15, but you have actual weapons of war that you've always been able to buy in America. So weapons of war has no meaning. Okay. Next thing. When we talk about large capacity magazines, and we're going to talk about how to argue the constitutional case in a minute, but in the meantime, when you talk about large capacity magazines, a lot of you know this, you don't call it large capacity magazine. That's a political propaganda term. You call them standard capacity magazines. And why do we know that they're standard? If you look at any procurement data, if you look at any procurement contract or any procurement request for bid or request for procurement, RFP, whatever you want to call it, by the Department of Homeland Security, by any law enforcement agency, Jerry will tell you all about this, I'm sure. They describe semi-automatic rifles and they describe magazines that hold 30 rounds for a rifle as standard capacity magazines in the context of personal protection devices, right? Personal protection devices, these are all considered defensive weapons, which means they're not assault weapons if it's a personal protection device, and that's what they're all described as. So when you talk about large capacity magazines, there is no such thing as standard capacity magazines, and that's what the government itself says. Next thing, of course, there's no such thing as gun violence. There's criminal violence done with guns. Never use the phrase gun violence. That's a propaganda term by the left. Do not allow them to break into that. Okay? And I'm going fast here. I'll try to get okay, good. 10 minutes up. We'll try to get a transcript or I'll probably say it on my YouTube channel or somewhere else so you can get it. Next thing, ghost gun. Propaganda term, don't say ghost gun. You say one of two things. It's either an unserialized gun or it's privately made firearm. Did you know, by the way, that the first serialization requirement in the United States did exist at the time of the founding, but it had nothing to do with government. At the time of the founding, people formed their own private militias, like George Washington, and when they would loan out the guns they bought for their militias and handed them out, they wanted the guns back. So they would inscribe, right? Like George Washington's gun number 1 through 500. Point being that the technology, remember the history is good for us too. The technology existed at the time of the founding to put numbers and serial numbers on guns, but it was never required. Never required. Why? We have a right. It's a natural right, Second Amendment. So the point being, when they say, why don't you put serialization on guns? Well, we could have done it. We never did it because it wasn't considered constitutional or appropriate. I think technically speaking, there's a few guns that had to be serialized in the 30s. But basically, I believe not until 1968 is when you first get basically all the guns. But I think there's a few exceptions to that in the 30s. But overall, really 68 is the right year. Okay. Next thing. Always remember that when a lower court misbehaves on the Second Amendment, feel free to call them an inferior court. Because under Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution, it says that the U.S. Constitution creates one Supreme Court, a single Supreme Court, and a number of inferior courts as defined by Congress. So feel free to call them an inferior court as appropriate. Next thing, gun culture. This is very important to get this right. It's very nuanced, very geeky for Boxes Diner viewers. Okay. The United States has a particular kind of gun culture. Gun culture is not the words to use. That's sloppy poppy. No. We're much smarter than that. We have a particular kind of gun culture. We have a private gun-owning, self-defense-oriented gun culture. Do you hear what I just said? We have a gun culture consisting of private gun ownership with a focus on self-defense against all forms of tyranny. All forms of tyranny. And that's a second important part. Why? Because all forms of tyranny includes animal attacks, which I've written about based on the founding, criminal attacks, terrorist attacks, tyrannical government, foreign invasions, domestic insurrections. That's why when you talk about the role of the Second Amendment, make sure you say it's about protecting us against all forms of tyranny. And John Locke, who inspired the Founding Fathers, talks about you're in a state of war when somebody or something threatens to kill you, right? And that could be, again, a tyrannical government. It could be an animal. Grizzly bears are dangerous, as Justice Kennedy talked about in Heller. He actually refers to bears and wolf attacks in the Heller oral argument, in addition to tyrannical government and other things. So the point being, the reason why this distinction on gun culture is important is you do not want to get conflated with European gun culture of hunting and shooting. Like in the UK, you can have guns to go shooting for fun or to shoot clay or to shoot foxes, maybe, but you can't use it for self-defense. So be very precise. The United States has a unique form of gun culture, self-defense oriented, private gun ownership, gun culture. Make sure you're precise on the kind of gun culture we are, because we're better than the European gun culture, which is all about sporting clays and the like. Next thing, children. They're very important on children. When you look at these arguments that talk about children being victims of gun deaths, be very careful when you look at the statistics. There's two games that they play. One is they usually exclude children between the ages of 0 and 1, so they can eliminate infant mortality. People, born and then they die a few weeks. So they eliminate the 0 to 1, even though I would say they're children, right? I would think an infant's a child, but they do exclude that. And of course, they include up to like the age of 18, 19, 20. We know from the Department of Justice itself that the average age of a person that joins a criminal violent gang is 15 in the United States. It's not Mark Smith, that's the Department of Justice. 15 years of age is the average age a gangbanger joins this gang, and they are defined as children because we know that they want to include gang violence within the definition of children. Okay? So we got 5 minutes. Is that what we're down to? Okay, 5 minutes. Am I going too fast? Okay. Don't talk about democracy. Democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. Talk about a Republican form of government or a constitutional form of government where certain things, as Justice Scalia said in Heller, are taken off the table, including our right to keep and bear arms. Don't forget, we're not a pure democracy. You don't want a pure democracy. The Founding Fathers did not want a pure democracy. If you read the Federalist Papers, they specifically said pure democracy is mob rule. And mob rule is no different than monarchical rule, because if they can take away your rights, if 51% of the people can enslave the other 49% of the people with one vote, one time, that's no good. The founders knew that. That's why they created the system of government that we now have. Okay, this is important. This is geeky. I'm warning you now. But it's very important what I'm about to say. And not that many pick up on this. I wrote a whole article about this, but I'm going to give you the headlight here. Most important thing. How many of you have heard the NRA slogan of when you ban guns, only outlaws will have guns, right? You ever heard that one? Oh, it's the NRA from the 21st century. Total BS. You know where that comes from? I'll tell you where it comes from. It comes from the year of our Lord, 1764, by an Italian Enlightenment criminologist by the name of Cesare Beccaria, who you may want to know because he was extremely influential to 2 people you may have heard of, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, who literally loved Cesare Beccaria so much that they literally wrote down his words from his famous 1764 book on crimes and punishments. Why is this so important? Because he said 2 critical things that is mission critical to understand, and it goes back to my rule. We went on public policy, we went on history. Here's the history we went on to show you that these slogans are not 21st century slogans. They're literally from our founding era, in fact, even before that. First of all, Cesare Beccaria writes, remember, the Founding Fathers, when they had the Constitutional Convention, Beccaria's book was at the library, used at the convention, okay? First thing he said is, just because something can be misused doesn't mean you can ban it. He literally writes about water and fire in this way. This is what Beccaria writes in 1764. False is the idea of utility that sacrifices 1,000 real advantages for one imaginary or trifling inconvenience. That would take fire from men because it burns, and water because it may drown in it. That has no remedy for evils except destruction. He's literally saying that if you apply the anti-gun approach to guns, to water and fire, you'd have to ban water and fire, and that's simply stupid. 1764. But it gets better. This is the one you want to remember. He says specifically, gun ban laws are terrible and should never be done. And now remember, 1764, Cesare Beccaria, highly influential on the Founding Fathers, including Jefferson and Adams. This is what he writes. Quote, such gun ban laws make things worse for the assaulted and better for the assailants. They serve rather to encourage than to prevent homicides. For an unarmed man may be attacked with greater confidence than an armed man. Cesare Beccaria, 1764. Our Founding Fathers read this guy in his book. And by the way, the liberals cite to him in the context of anti-death penalty litigation to show you that even the liberals think this guy's super duper important on the 8th Amendment. Not so much on the 2nd, by the way. But that's okay. I brought it to life with the law review article, so it's out there. Okay, so I got like 3 more minutes to go, so let me hit the highlights here. Okay, 1 minute. Most important thing here is how to deal with Heller and Bruin. A lot of anti-gunners are out there talking about groundbreaking this. No, Let me cut to the chase. In 2008, the Supreme Court in Heller laid out, you look at the text of the Constitution. If it's covered by the text, the burden shifts to the government to look for some sort of historical tradition of banning something or preventing something. Okay? Bruin did the same thing that Heller did, except it made it sippy cup easy to use for lower court judges that were screwing up Heller. That's it. Now, the point to take away from this is Heller and Bruin with McDonald laid out the law of the Second Amendment. So where are we today with the Second Amendment in terms of litigation? And this is what you must understand. It's very simple. The groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting approach to the Second Amendment is over. The fundamental approaches are done. So all we're doing now is applying the existing law to all these issues. That's all we're doing. The law is done. We're just simply applying the law. The revolution is over. Now it's about application. And that's it. Nothing crazy, groundbreaking going forward. Don't let the anti-gunners go screaming hair on fire. It's not true. This is the basic application of law, which judges do every single day. And I'm confident that they will continue to improve as they learn more about the Second Amendment and about guns, which is going to be largely because you guys are going to do a great job in the media teaching judges, lawmakers, and others about it. So thank you for your time.